Alaska Insight is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers just like you. Thank you.
Lawmakers overrode the governor's veto of an education funding bill this week. It's the first time since 2009 that a veto override vote was successful.
And so by a vote of 46 yeas to 14 nays, the joint legislative session has overridden the governor's veto of House Bill 57.
What else did legislators accomplish this year with the budget, the PFD, and more? We'll ask right now when lawmakers join us for Alaska Insight. Good evening, and thanks for joining us for the final episode of this season of Alaska Insight. Tonight, legislators join us to discuss what they were able to accomplish during the session that just concluded and what bills were left on the table that they will consider next year. Before we get to that discussion, here are some of the top stories of the week from Alaska Public Media's collaborative statewide news network. Without a single vote to spare, the U.S. House passed a mega bill on Thursday containing a number of national Republican priorities. The bill cuts nearly $100 billion from Medicaid and SNAP, also called food stamps, shifting many of those costs to the states. In Alaska, the bill would put the state on the hook for more than $60 million in SNAP benefits, while also cutting around $6 million in federal funds used to administer the program. Health researchers say a work requirement to qualify for Medicaid could cause as many as 14,000 Alaskans to lose their health care coverage. Alaska's only representative, Republican Nick Begich, voted yes on the bill. In an interview Thursday, he praised the tax cuts, as well as a section promoting oil development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The bill goes next to the Senate, where it could pass with just Republican votes. However, several Republican senators have already said they don't like the bill. A grand jury on Tuesday indicted 44-year-old criminal defense attorney Justin Facey on charges alleging he was involved with the distribution and use of controlled substances like fentanyl out of his Anchorage home, along with two other charges related to having firearms connected with drug trafficking and use. A memorandum filed by prosecutors on Wednesday alleges that Facey described himself as a cartel attorney, working with a gang that smuggled hard drugs from Mexico to Alaska. The memorandum accuses Facey of helping the gang to launder money and offering to smuggle a drug trafficker out of Alaska after they had nearly been arrested. It also alleges that Facey was using up to an ounce of methamphetamine a day. Alaska lawmakers on Tuesday voted to override Governor Mike Dunleavy's veto of House Bill 57, which aims to increase per-student education funding in the state while also implementing a number of policy changes. It's the third time in 2 years that legislators have passed a bill increasing the base student allocation, but the first time one has successfully overcome a veto from Dunleavy. It's the first substantial increase to the education funding formula since 2017. It's also the first time the Alaska legislature has overridden a governor's veto since 2009. 11 minority Republicans joined the members of the bipartisan House and Senate coalitions to vote for the override. In a social media post Tuesday, the governor said the bill's policy reforms did not go far enough. You can find the full version of these and many more stories on our website, alaskapublic.org, or download the Alaska Public Media app on your phone. Now on to our discussion about the work done in the legislative session that just ended. Besides an increase in school funding, lawmakers were able to pass a budget, approve legislation to raise new tax revenue, and more. They got their work done with a day to spare in the first session of the 34th legislature, but it was not without tension. Most of that tension was between the bipartisan coalitions and Governor Mike Dunleavy. The governor was adamant about certain elements related to education spending that he insisted were must-haves, and he expressed frustration at a press conference that negotiations were not successful. But lawmakers said they were frustrated by a lack of engagement with the state's top executive when speaking to reporters on Tuesday.
A number of those things that were left out, for example, were teacher incentive pay, which we had in the bill last year, a robust approach to charter schools, which we would have an alternative authorizers to authorize our charter schools, support for homeschooling. A lot of this was left out in order to try and negotiate something this year. We started off in a negotiation process early in January to try and come to a conclusion. Obviously, that didn't work.
It seems to me, I don't want to complain too much about the governor, but he's just not been available. He's not here. You know that better than I do. You probably have not had a chance to talk to the governor. He's not available, and neither is his staff.
Joining me tonight to discuss the work that was completed and what will be in front of lawmakers next January is Senate Majority Leader, Anchorage Republican Kathy Giessel, and Speaker of the House, Dillingham Independent Bryce Edgman. Welcome, both of you. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Lori.
Nice to be here.
I know that Senator Stevens was referencing the fiscal policy working group that the governor had wanted, but also a bit of general frustration about a lack of engagement. The video we just saw paints a very divergent picture about negotiations during this session. The governor said he tried to negotiate early on. Senator Stevens said the governor was not available. Where did those talks break down? Senator, do you want to start us off here?
You know, Lori, the governor designated staff to negotiate with us. And the staff actually were good to work with. The problem came when the governor didn't agree with what had been negotiated through his staff. So that's really what President Senator Stevens was getting at there. We actually need the governor himself to be in the room and to agree to meet with us and talk through these hard issues.
Yes, thank you. Representative Edgman, your thoughts about trying to work with the governor during this session?
Yeah, I would echo what Majority Leader just mentioned. It's really hard to work with a governor who's not physically present in the building and who, over the years, Governor Dunleavy's style is, I think, starkly different than the previous governors I've worked with as a legislator, going back into the days of Sarah Palin, Sean Parnell, Bill Walker, and Governor Dunleavy in his 7th year. Governor Dunleavy focuses less, I think, on sort of personal relationships with legislators and works more comfortably with, more conservative legislators who are apt to be more supportive of him. And I think the whole education fight that we've been in really goes back to last year and even before, because in calendar year 2024, we had an omnibus bill that was very controversial too and came one vote shy of being overridden. That was again last year. This year, the 46-14 vote, I think, spoke volumes to a lot of things. Frustration working with the governor, the fact that his worldview of Alaska and the state of public education is vastly different than the most of us. And at the end of the day, the coming together in a very bipartisan manner of Democrats, Republicans, and independents to put together a very almost unprecedented, overriding of the governor really spoke volumes about the extent of things.
Sticking with you a moment, Representative Edgman, House Bill 57, as we know, increased the base student allocation, the BSA, by $700. It banned cell phones in school, changed how charter schools can be created. School officials were hoping for at least a $1,000 BSA, and one district superintendent said with inflation, the increase needed to be nearly $1,800. How much have school leaders said this will help, and do you anticipate considering another increase next session, or will that be it for the foreseeable future?
Well, at this point, superintendents and school boards and other educators are willing to take whatever we can give them. Something is better than nothing. And of course, we started out the debate in January with an $1,800 BSA with some inflation adjusters attached to it. We brought that down to $1,000. It hovered around $680 until in the end we finally agreed that $700 was, sort of the number that best met the fiscal realities in an era when oil prices were declining. So, next year, I think it's pretty unanimously felt, at least here in the Capitol at this point, that the fiscal environment is going to be more challenging. The needs aren't going to go away, and we really don't know what's happening back east. But I'll close by just saying that the state of our public school systems in Alaska is very dire at this point. They need a relief. And, they also need help, on the policy end of things, which we view as a longer term effort as opposed to a shorter term.
Senator Giesel, the governor wanted teacher retention bonuses, $5,000 for urban teachers, $10,000 to $15,000 for rural, saying teacher retention would be higher if they were getting an annual bonus. What's your response? What do you hear from districts and teachers about why they leave?
Lori, it's a mixed message sometimes. One of the common themes is that our teachers in Alaska have no Social Security as a safety net at retirement. They also don't have a secure pension. That's a factor. We've always had long-term teachers, not just in rural Alaska, but in urban Alaska. But that's changed over the last approximately 10 years as we've seen more and more turnover happening because of that particular issue. Now, the salary itself, absolutely. Yes, the governor proposed a hiring bonus, so to speak. In rural Alaska, it'd be $15,000, and it would be for 3 years, right? So at the end of that time, when that bonus was up, we have a lot of international teachers now, a lot of teachers from the Philippines who are doing a fantastic job in our rural schools. But those teachers now can leave with $45,000 after 3 years, and we're still not retaining them. And yet the community, in a small community, the personal relationships, the knowing individual, knowing the teachers, knowing the students, that relationship is key to the trust that small relationships, that small communities have with their teachers. That's a critical piece. That's why retention is so critical. And that's why returning to a modernized, very constrained, but still livable retirement program is so important. The other thing I would add related to the BSA, one positive is that $700, even though it's only $20 per student more than last year, is in the formula. It will go forward. And that's a strong positive for the legislation that we were able to pass, Lori.
Sticking with you, Senator, lawmakers overcame the governor's veto of the education bill, but he could decide to veto line items like that BSA increase. That would take more votes to override. How concerned are you that he might do that in June, and do you think you could muster the votes then to override it?
Well, we absolutely are aware he could do that in June. It was such a strong vote to override the governor on this policy bill that I think there is a strong likelihood that we would have the 3/4 vote it would take to override the appropriation veto. An appropriation veto is a higher bar. It's 2/3 for a policy override, which is what we achieved. So I'm guardedly optimistic that we could override a red pen running through that $700 BSA.
And Representative Edgman, your thoughts about that. Do you think you could get folks back together, and how quickly could that happen if the governor did decide to veto in June?
Well, that's a great question. Number one, if he did veto the appropriation sort of underlying the base student allocation that we put into law with the override, he would essentially be, denying the force of the law, breaking the law, number one. Number two, if he does it, I think it's going to change the political dynamic in a way that that will certainly grab his attention. And like Senator Giesel was just saying a moment ago, the likelihood in January of getting to that 45 vote threshold of the 60-member legislature, I think is very real. And it will be quite dramatic for that to happen. And I think the table is set for us to all come together in January.
But if the governor did that in June and you were able to override that veto, how would that affect school districts? Would it be too late by then if it's in the middle of the school year and you're doing this in January?
Well, it's my understanding that school districts get their funding from the state in two different tranches. And the second tranche would be in the second part of the fiscal year, which would coincide with the opening of the upcoming session. So I think it'd still be very material that we would override and sort of force the governor's hand in terms of applying funding the entire $700 BSA amount, which, by the way, we have budgeted for in the budget that we're currently in the process of about to send him, where he has 20 days to take action on.
Representative, I want to stay with you for a moment. One bill aimed at collecting new taxes was passed. Tax would be collected from out-of-state companies selling to Alaskans online. The governor said there was a game being played with the online tax concept because it was tied to school funding. Has he clarified what he meant by a game being played?
Yeah, I don't know what he means by that because, education policy is usually complicated. It takes, in many occasions, 2 years, the full session, to sort of move through the committee process and to get consensus built and so forth. And we did the best we could this past session on a lot of topics that, we ordinarily would take a lot more time to do that. And in the bill, House Bill 57, that we overrode him on, there's a provision there that calls for the formation of a task force that looks at a lot more longer term issues that, that will take into consideration what the governor is wanting. But I found it really interesting that the governor was prioritizing some issues like open enrollment and among a few others that really weren't a strong focus of the school districts. They were a strong focus of the governor's desire and the commissioner of education's leanings, but they certainly weren't being espoused by the broader education community. So, to put all of that up against the funding that the school districts so badly need, to me, was a real head scratcher.
Thank you. Senator Giesel, the governor said earlier this week that he isn't interested in signing tax bills until lawmakers have a comprehensive future fiscal plan. How do you respond to that? Should it be an all-encompassing omnibus type fiscal bill, or bringing new revenue in as plans develop, like the stalled oil tax credit reduction bill?
Lori, I want to go back to your comment that the governor made about he didn't like games being played. There's no game here. The fact of the matter is Alaska does not have enough revenue to meet its core values, its core services. Right now, Alaskans need to know that oil no longer pays the bills. 60% of our unrestricted general fund this year, $3.8 billion, came from the earnings of the permanent fund. We have now flipped to those days back in 1976 when Alaskans, I being one of them, voted to create the permanent fund, making oil revenue actually grow for us. So now we're depending on the earnings of that fund. Oil is not paying the bills. So you asked about new revenue. Absolutely. And the bill that funds education, you're referring to a revenue bill that would put a tax on out-of-state corporations that sell internet across into Alaska, make internet sales. This would not tax Alaskans. It taxes those corporations that are located in other states. This would bring in revenue that helps fund education, prisons, public safety, roads. We have to find new sources of revenue. The Senate has proposed 3 potential. One of them is Senate Bill 113, which we just referred to, related to education. Another one would remove a loophole related to corporate taxes and would include S corporations with our C corporations so that there was equity with our oil companies in terms of the taxes they pay. The governor is asking for a full fiscal plan. That's what we're aiming for. We have tried to have this conversation with him. He is not interested. The proposals that we've made were actually recommended by his revenue commissioner in 2021. Lori, the other thing we need to correct protects that permanent fund itself. We need to turn that fund into an actual endowment and create a spending limit on the earnings of that fund. That would take a constitutional amendment. We have a resolution to do that. We weren't able to get that completed this year. We're looking hopefully to do that next year. It's one of the pieces of legislation that we need to keep working on in our second session.
And related to the permanent fund, the dividend was set at $1,000, the lowest adjusted for inflation in the history of the payouts from the fund. Talk about how you were able to get consensus on something that we know is the third rail of Alaska politics and that many Alaskans have come to depend on.
Lori, it's absolutely true that there is a portion of our population that counts on that dividend to pay bills for heating, for rent, for food. There's also a significant portion of our population that doesn't depend on it and said to us, spend some of that dividend. We were actually able to move about $200 million into education because of constraining that dividend from the $1,400 we had last year to every man, woman, and child to the $1,000 this year. Lori, we are at a time of having to make those hard choices. We've checked all the cushions in the couch. We've pulled all the change out. We've made one-time movements of money. We will not be able to duplicate again to pay the bills this year. Next year is going to be even tighter. So, Lori, that's another reason that we need to protect that permanent fund, because otherwise we will not be able to fund a dividend at all in the future. The permanent fund statutes, the constitutional amendment needs to be passed to protect that fund, create a spending limit, and create secure revenue going forward.
Thank you. Representative Edgman, the governor says he wants a fiscal plan. What do you think he means after offering a budget with a huge deficit and no new revenue plans? You said on Tuesday that unless the governor gets involved and makes some hard choices, this could all be for naught. What do you want to see from him in this regard?
I want to see some action. And I also want to see him put some political capital, some skin into the game, and really get involved in a meaningful way that helps sort of allay the concerns that a lot of us have had, that we've heard this story before. And, you know, we've seen the governor on the cusp of introducing a sales tax a couple of years ago. Before then, he was talking about the lottery system with maybe a lottery tax and so forth. But nothing really has transpired from that point forward. And, you know, I've been around long enough as a legislator to know that in order to take on big structural problems like putting a spending cap into place or coming up with a statewide revenue source, whatever it might be, you know, everyone has to be all in. We need the executive branch with his state agencies to do the aforementioned analysis. We certainly need the legislature to have skin in the game, and we need the business community, and we need communities around the state to be a part of that, because it all involves political risk to make tough choices. And absent the executive branch, who has the biggest bully pulpit, the loudest bullhorn, being involved, and really telling us in the legislature, I'm going to veto any revenue measure, big or small, that you put on my desk, really constrains from the get-go the ability to have the conversation. So if he is really serious, I want to see some skin in the game from him, and I want to see some action.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment more. Senator Giesel talked about a constitutional amendment. The governor always pushes for a so-called full PFD. This year it would have been nearly $4,000. Lawmakers have the appropriation power for that annual payment. Do you see a path to changing how the PFD is calculated to take the heat out of this annual debate?
It's not going to happen, I will tell you that, without involvement and a real commitment of, applying political capital by the governor. It just simply isn't going to happen. And I was, looking in preparation for this conversation tonight, I was looking back a few years ago, and since 2015, we've had 16 special sessions, 16. A lot of those have been because of fights over the size of the PFD or the inability to get a 3/4 vote to tap into our constitutional budget reserve, our largest savings account. But it's very difficult to put these big pieces into place, and everybody has to be involved.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. This time went by too quickly. I really appreciate your time tonight. Lawmakers, along with all Alaskans, now wait to see if the governor will sign the bills they pass this session or veto them, or specific budget items within them. As you heard from lawmakers tonight, Alaska's fiscal constraints mean tough decisions will likely have to continue to be made to ensure that permanent fund earnings, now contributing more than half of the revenue for the annual state budget, are protected into the future. That's it for this edition of Alaska Insight. Visit our website, alaskapublic.org, for breaking news and reports from our partner stations across the state. While you're there, sign up for our free daily digest so you won't miss any of Alaska's top stories of the day. Thanks for joining us this evening for our final episode of Season 8 of Alaska Insight. We'll be back next fall with a new lineup of programs. Thanks for your continuing interest and ideas. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night and have a great summer.